Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to welcome you to the Montana World Affairs Council Distinguished Speaker Program. My name is Michelle Rutherford, and I am the director of the World Affairs Council here in Montana. Very proud. Been here since 1985. And I love Montana. We are delighted that you are here this evening for a very timely discussion on the status of U.S. and Iran relations. These aren't only relevant to the U.S., but to the world. I am also privileged tonight to be joined by U.S. Ambassador Mark Johnson, to my right, the founder of the Montana World Affairs Council, and our distinguished guest, U.S. Ambassador John Limbert. I'm also pleased that we have a number of our board members here tonight and supporters. Thank you for being here. I also would like to thank our sponsors tonight, because without them, these important platforms would not be possible. And I have a board over there with some membership opportunities, and that includes our sponsors such as Washington Foundation, S.G. Long and Company, the Englehart Foundation, the Dana Gallery, Allegiance, Geisler Steel, First Interstate Bank, and several other generous sponsors. So please go and see our sponsorship board this evening. And finally, we're honored to have such a distinguished speaker here this morning, Ambassador John Limbert, and his lovely wife, Parvane. You will find Ambassador Limbert's biography on the inside cover of your event program tonight. However, I would like to say that Ambassador Limbert has received the highest award for valor that the U.S. Department of State has ever given. He is one of the brave Americans who, in his own words, he had an extended stay in Iran. And when the Ayatollah came to change the management of the Hotel Tehran, Ambassador Limbert, he is a distinguished diplomat and is someone who in terms of public service to the United States and in the international community has earned our applause. But please hold that for a moment. So with that said, I would like to invite Ambassador Mark Johnson up to the podium to say a few words.
Michelle, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And it's just wonderful to have all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. Your enthusiasm and support really helps us, keeps us going, and we appreciate it greatly, especially on a weather night like this. I thought for a moment when the Limberts were about to come, we would have to arrange dog sleds somewhere to get them here, but it's worked out very well, and we're very grateful that they are here. We're going to look tonight at the fascinating and very important country of Iran, and you'll have a rare opportunity to hear from someone who knows a lot about it, so be sure and have some good questions for him. We do two things at the Council, and I'll briefly touch on them. Tonight you're witnessing one of those. We do distinguished speaker programs. We've done about 300 in our career, in our existence since the year 2000. And I'll go out on a limb and say tonight is probably one of the most important. I really believe that, and we have the perfect speaker to address the topic. The other thing we do is our council in the classroom, our work with high school students, fostering global awareness, global education. We think probably we're the biggest one in the state. An example, this morning, Ambassador Limbert spoke via internet to several rural Montana high schools. And if you've been around in Montana, you know what that means. For example, I don't know how many of you have been to Hayes Lodgepole on the Fort Belknap Reservation. It's a big deal. these kids have never seen anyone like John Limbert. And it changes lives and it touches lives. And quite honestly, we should be doing more because this generation has no choice, frankly, but to engage. Our generation, yeah, whatever. But, well, now wait a minute. Some of us, you have to admit this, produce the best music in civilization, but thank you, fellow baby boomers. That's another subject for another day. But it is terribly important that we continue this work, and it's a pretty thinly disguised appeal for your support, financial and otherwise, because we should be doing more, and we now have the ability to do more. So thank you very much for all your support up till now. Now, Iran is a fascinating country. It is a difficult country, a complex. It's heir to one of the great civilizations in the world, the Persian Empire. And as I said a moment ago at our reception, the heart and soul of Iran are the people. And the people are wonderful. Just keep that in mind. And when you see the news with bearded people scowling, there's a whole nother side of Iran. Iran is an important topic to the Montana World Affairs Council. Some of you may recall in the year 2001, March, we hosted the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, one of the few cities in the United States where the ambassador was permitted to come out outside of his radius, his controlled radius of New York City, and speak. It was a great event. I was very nervous. The last time he'd spoke had been in Southern California, and the person down there told me we had 225 security people to guard him. I got a guy from campus security. But the point is, we didn't need anyone. And it was, the ambassador gave the line of the regime as you would expect. He got a good hearing. He got in return tough but fair questions. And it was a perfect exchange, all right? And so we like to think what the Montana World Affairs Council does, and other councils, we create the discussions on tough subjects, you're going to hear it tonight, that the folks in Washington seem to be unable or unwilling to do. And that's why, need I say, at this day and age, it's important that we continue this. Now, as I said, we have probably the foremost authority in the United States on Iran. John Limbert was a career Foreign Service officer for 30 years. He served across a wide swath of the Middle East, from Algeria in the west to Iran in the east. He was in Baghdad during the Reconstruction period in 2003, 2004. He led a team that helped restore the National Museum in Baghdad. He held a variety of policy jobs in Washington, D.C. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iranian Affairs at the U.S. State Department. And that's the pivotal place in the bureaucracy, in the State Department bureaucracy, where policy issues are debated and decided in the State Department, a very important position. His interest in Iran predates his Foreign Service career. He was a Peace Corps volunteer there. He returned as a teacher of English. And the most important thing about that is that's where he met his wife, Parvene. Parvene is with us, and she is a very accomplished, distinguished artist, and we have some flyers, I think, at the front desk, and we urge you to take a look at that. It's very, very impressive, so thank you for sharing that with us, Parvene. That's very good. John is retired now. He teaches international affairs at the U.S. Naval Academy. He helps prepare a new generation of naval officers to face the challenges they surely will face, and we think that's very important. Now, so far I haven't mentioned the most important thing about his career. That occurred November 4th, 1979. On that day, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, in downtown Tehran, was overrun by a group of militant students, and John and his colleagues at the embassy, 60 plus at the time, were taken hostage. A horrible ordeal that they had to suffer through 444 days. And there's a quirk of history I'd like to share with you, ladies and gentlemen. As he was going through this in Tehran, I was in Washington, D.C. on the other end, in the Office of Iranian Affairs, the Iran desk at the U.S. State Department, and I was part of a team trying to monitor what in the world is going on. It was very hard to know what was going on, and it was a very scary time, if you will. I've never met him. I've known of him. I've admired his work. So this is really the first time we've ever met. So, all roads, lead to Missoula. So, who needs Washington? Now, I want to show some brief footage of that actual day when the embassy was overtaken. Just takes a couple of moments, but I think you'll appreciate it, and you will see our guest spotlighted in that. So if we could show this. This is the takeover of the U.S. Embassy.
In 1979, it became clear just how exposed our diplomats can be. When 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage in Iran.
It was in some ways an ideal assignment if it all hadn't come crashing down on the 4th of November.
Here was not an embassy. It was a CIA center. This was a den of espionage where they were plotting against the Iranian people.
The United States had admitted the deposed Shah of Iran for medical treatment. I think we expected that there would be some reaction, but what we did not expect was that when the embassy was taken, those in charge, those in authority, would actually side with the occupiers. I was actually outside the door on the second floor attempting to talk down the attackers and to dissuade them from what they were doing, a task at which I was notably unsuccessful.
The Iran hostage crisis would not end quickly.
I got a care package from home, from my family, and it included some books. And the books were things like War and Peace, Brothers Karamazov. In other words, average length about 1,200 pages. And I think the message was pretty clear at that point. They said, you're in for the long term.
The hostages spent 444 days in captivity in Iran.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure and my great honor to present to you Ambassador John Limbert.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you. Excuse me, slide one, please. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Johnson. And let me thank all who have were so kind as to invite Parvaneh and me to this beautiful place, to Missoula. It's my first time here, and it's wonderful. I'm sure we'll be back to sample more of the hospitality. And I should mention Nancy Matthews, and I should mention also Michelle and Emma from the World Affairs Council, and of course I want to thank my wife Parvaneh, because whatever I say about Iran, she has taught me all of that, and she always makes sure that she sets me right when I get onto the wrong path, except the time when I decided that I should volunteer and go and serve in the embassy in Tehran. That was a major mistake. Anyway, now obviously, I mean, I'm not saying anything you don't know when I say that the U.S.-Iran relationship has been difficult, to use a word beloved of the Foreign Service, has been difficult for 37 years. Well, since 1979. I mean, here is what you see there in this first slide is an Iranian-American encounter from October of 1979, about a month before we were taken. It was at the United Nations, and you see on your on your right is Secretary Vance, then Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. On one side it's the right, and one side it's the left, I see. So either on your right or on your left, Secretary Vance. And the other was his Iranian counterpart, the Foreign Minister Ibrahim Yazdi. And the two of them met at the United Nations. At that time, relations still existed. We still had diplomatic relations, so there was no big deal for the two of them to meet. But the meeting best described as a disaster. And that disastrous meeting set the tone for U.S.-Iran interactions for about 34 years. Slide, please. This is another Iranian-American encounter from about 6 months later. And this is at the embassy. The person with the glasses you may recognize, except that I had darker hair and 1970s dorky glasses at the time. But there we were. At that time, we were guests of the. I guess you would call after the. Put it this way, the American embassy had gone condo on us, and we were the guests of that. We were the guests there. We were forced to stay there, and that the other person in the picture is Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader. At the time, he was Friday prayer leader of Tehran, which was a big deal. Which was a big deal. Well, neither of these meetings were friendly. These were not friendly encounters. And we were not friends then, and here we are 37 years later, and we're still not friends. And the question I put to you is, are we condemned to be enemies indefinitely? I mean, I don't say forever, because nothing is forever, or not much, but are we condemned to be enemies indefinitely? Now let me begin in the interest of full disclosure with a personal note. As Ambassador Johnson mentioned, my connections to Iran are very deep and very personal. They go back well over 50 years. But I should also say that I have no particular love for the Islamic Republic. That is not my favorite form of government. For one thing, I think that our Iranian friends and our Iranian relatives, my Iranian relatives, they deserve better than that. I mean, with all of their warmth and their creativity and their great culture, they deserve a government that treats them decently, that doesn't throw journalists or activists or women's rights people or human rights lawyers, doesn't throw these people in jail. In terms of our relationship, I've also argued for a long time. I've argued for a different relationship than the one of hostility, ongoing hostility. I've argued that there should be a different relationship, one that better serves the interests of both sides, that would be more productive for both sides. Now, this position, I should say, has not earned me a lot of friends. Delusional, naive, those are just some of the nicer terms that people use about me. Some people have said, oh, he's the Manchurian Candidate. If you're familiar with that wonderful movie, the original one with Lawrence Harvey and Frank Sinatra, and sort of that's what they call me. I kind of like that because I like the movie so much. I don't know if there are any Persian speakers in the group. The Iranians call me something, it's a little rougher. I'll only say that it ends with a suffix kesh. And it's not nice. It's not very nice, so I won't repeat what it is. Go to the next slide, please. Now, here's a slide that I think illustrates the current state of U.S.-Iranian relations. This is really where we've been for about 37 years, on a road to nowhere. And you could say, I was back there when this road was built. I like to say, I was even there when the contract was awarded to build this road. But what I didn't believe at the time was that we would be stuck on this road for so long, for 36 years. And I was wrong. I was wrong. We have been stuck on this road. But then when I think about this, I realize, I've been wrong about Iran a lot. And consecutive American administrations facing the unpleasant reality of Iran have tried almost everything. But being wrong, as it turns out, part of dealing with Iran, if you do it right, is being wrong. Now that sounds paradoxical, but it isn't if you think about it. They say to be an Iran expert, you really have to, the only thing you have to do is to say two things. One is, I don't know, and two is, it's very complicated. Serious. Now, I suggest you apply that test in the coming months to officials who talk about Iran. If do they use that phraseology? To me, that's a good test. Do they know if they know what they're talking about? I've certainly been wrong a lot, and I'd be the first to admit it. And anyone who doesn't admit it, I think, again, in this case, doesn't know what he's talking about. So, President Carter, President Reagan had appalling experiences with Iran. President Carter lost his presidency because of what happened to us. Ronald Reagan came that close to losing his presidency over Iran-Contra. So subsequent administrations would have preferred to ignore the whole place, to have nothing to do with it. But they couldn't. Let me paraphrase a former resident of New York by the name of Leon Trotsky, who once said, he said famously, you may have no business with war, but war has business with you. Well, Iran was a little bit like that. We may not have had any business with Iran, but over this whole period, Iran had a lot of business with us. And so subsequent American administrations, like it or not, were forced to deal with Iran. And they tried everything. They couldn't ignore it, so they tried to contain it, they tried to talk to it, they tried to bribe it, they tried to overthrow it, they tried to change its government, they tried to make peace with it, and nothing worked. And when we look at the period from 1979 until 2013, we see a landscape littered with wrecks of efforts to do something about Iran. If I were better with computers, I could Photoshop some wrecked cars on that road and sort of put them there. Because all of these efforts ran aground on mistrust, misreading, bad luck, bad timing, and bad assumptions. As a result, we remained on that road. And what did we do? The only exchanges we had were trading insults, trading accusations, and trading threats. And that's what we did for 30 years. We stood on opposite sides of an abyss, and yelled at glared at each other and called each other names like axis of evil and great Satan. And what was the result? The result was decades of futility and frustration, and a Cold War that sometimes threatened and still threatens to become something much worse. Now, why is this so? Why is this so? This is usually my final exam question that I ask my students in Annapolis. And they say, what's the answer? And I say, damned if I know. And they come up with some pretty good stuff, believe it or not. But why couldn't we get off this road? What made us captives of a downward spiral of hostility that we could not get out of? Well, here's my analysis. I don't have a good explanation, but here's what I would suggest. Now, I'm trained as a historian. So what do historians do when you ask them a question? They say, let's go back to the beginning. And in this case, the beginning is the Old Testament. And it's the book of Daniel. And here you see Daniel with his friends. And the book of Daniel tells us about an empire called the Empire of two people, the Medes and the Persians. Slide, please. And here are Medes, and here are Medes, and here are Persians. I'll resist the temptation to say, give the old thing about one man's Mede is another man's Persian. No, terrible. Anyway, but I won't say that. I won't say that. Anyway, so here are Medes and Persians from the glorious reliefs of 2,500 years ago at Persepolis. And according to the book of Daniel, this was an empire of laws. And it was an empire of laws, as he said, this is the Medes and the Persians whose laws alter not. They do not change. Slide, please. Because they were literally written in stone. And here is a cuneiform tablet, and changing these laws, as you could see, would be very, very difficult. So this was an empire of iron laws, unchangeable. And I would submit to you that for over 30 years, there was a set of iron, unchangeable laws that governed Iranian-American relations. And these, it turned out, were very difficult to change. Now, here is my translation of this stone tablet. No, we missed that. Anyway, I'll give you my translation, which is basically there were five of these laws. The first said, never walk through an open door. It's much more fun to bang your head against a wall. Law number 2 was never say yes to anything that the other side proposes. Because if you do, you'll look weak. Now, I'm not making this up. I've seen this. I see this from the inside. Third, never forget that the other side, and it doesn't matter whether you're looking from Tehran or from Washington, the other side is infinitely hostile, devious, domineering, and irrational. It is the embodiment of all that is evil. Law number 4, which really follows from law number 3, therefore, never forget that whatever the other side proposes must contain some kind of trick. It doesn't matter what it is. If the other side says the sky is blue, there's obviously a trick involved. There's some devious motive. That's because its only purpose in life is to cheat you. And the 5th law is whenever you seem to be making progress, someone or some diabolical coincidence is going to come along and mess it up. And we've seen this. We saw this on the verge of the implementation of the nuclear agreement when all of a sudden 2 American boats, small boats from the U.S. Navy, drift into Iranian territorial waters. And you have people screaming, and they are captured, and you have people screaming hostage crisis, all over again. And it threatened, if I use the naval image, to torpedo the whole system, this whole agreement, which has been so painfully negotiated over a couple of years. Now, from where I sat, I came out of retirement, took leave from the Naval Academy in 2009, 2010, went back to the State Department to support what seemed to me, at the beginning of President Obama's first term, an honest effort to get off the road and to break the grip of these rules. And if you look at what he did, I mean, he said in even his debates with, even going back to his primary debates with then Senator Clinton, he talked about, yes, we must be talking to our adversaries. I would talk to Iran, I would talk to Cuba, I would talk to North Korea. And he got heavily criticized for that, actually. Probably more harshly criticized by Senator Clinton than by Senator McCain in the general election. But he kept at it, and when in his first inaugural address, in his address in Cairo, when he accepted the Nobel Prize, he kept saying, we need to change this way of doing business. We need to be able to talk to each other. And in his New Year's address, for example, in 2009, he quoted the Persian poet Sa'di, talking about how all human beings are part of one another and how they depend on each other. And quoting Persian poetry, sends a very powerful message of respect. But the problem was that no one, I think, appreciated, or no one really foresaw, how tough and how strong those damn rules were, and how much we were in their grip. And so things remain dysfunctional. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, that's okay. Go back one. Things remained dysfunctional for about 5 years, the first 4 to 5 years of Obama's presidency. And it took about 5 years for the his administration for things to change. So that's how tough things were. The irony is that it wasn't always this way, that there's a history of very constructive and positive interactions between our two countries. If we go back farther, it's a very different story. Let's go back. I like to talk about, when I talk about Iranian history to my classes, I talk about something I call the 100-year struggle. It's really more than 100 years now, but this is a struggle. This has been a struggle starting in probably the early 20th century that most Iranians have been engaged in to become masters in their own house, to assert their dignity, to assert their independence, to gain some kind of control over their own destiny. And here is a picture from 1906. This is the Iranian constitutional revolution, in which the Iranians said, we need a system of laws that even the king will follow. It was one of the earliest written constitutions in the Middle East. If you notice, by the way, the people demonstrating in favor of the Constitution are clerics. Because in 1906, this was the intelligentsia of Iran. The literacy rate in Iran was about 5%. And this was because education was in the hands of the clerics. These were the people who were literate. These were the people who knew that something was not right in the country, and the country, in order, if it was going to progress, if things were going to change, it needed some kind of basic law. And in this struggle, in this 100-year struggle, Americans were usually on the right side. We were with the good guys. The next slide, please. I mean, here is, for example, Howard Baskerville, Princeton graduate, went off. Princeton was then very much a Presbyterian school. He graduates, goes off to Tabriz to teach in a Presbyterian missionary school, joins the constitutional struggle, and is killed in 1909. And he is still known as the American martyr. Another slide, please. Here is a team that the U.S. sent to Iran, led by President Taft in 1910, sent this group, led by a man named Morgan Schuster, in order that Iran could get control of its finances. I mean, it didn't have much money, but it needed whatever money it had, it needed control over. It needed to make a budget, it needed to regularize expenditures, it needed to collect tax, it needed to be able to collect taxes. So Schuster worked with the parliament, the new parliament, in order to get some order. Here's really another picture. If you have another slide, please. This is the Tabriz Memorial School. This is that same school where Baskerville taught. And this is a picture, staff faculty photograph taken about 1924, and that's what the sign behind it says. This is something like the 34th year of the Tabriz Memorial School. But what's interesting to me is look at. This was, again, a time, maybe Iran's 1924, so maybe the literacy rate was 10%, was 10%. But look at the people who shared one goal, and that was the goal of education. As you see in the front, there are American missionaries, there are men and women, both American missionaries. There are the Iranians, westernized Iranians, the so-called Fokoli, as they were known then. The necktie wearers, the false collar wearers, also there. And you see two clerics. You see the clerics who sort of said this impulse to educate has a religious blessing, that people should be educated. Now. I mean, politically and maybe socially, these people probably couldn't agree on very much. They had very different visions of the world. But they could agree on one thing, and that was educate. We need to educate the young people. The sad part of this picture, of course, is that was 1924, 2016. You couldn't do a picture like this. You just could not. You couldn't get these people into the same picture. Okay, another scene from the struggle. In the 1950s, this is the period when Iranians, again, part of the same struggle, talking about constitution, finances, education. Now we're talking about getting control of the oil. Iran's big resource, the source of 90% of its money. And it had been in British hands since 1908, since oil was first discovered in 1908. And now the Iranians are saying, no, this is our oil, we need to control. We should control it. If we are an independent country, we would control it. And there's a very eloquent, this is a demonstration in favor of the nationalists. And there's a very eloquent slogan down there which simply says, leave our country alone. Let our country be free. And in this phase of the struggle, next slide please, many Americans, many in the U.S. had sympathy for the nationalist side. And their leader, the Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, And here you see Prime Minister Mossadegh and meeting President Truman at the White House. And Truman and Mossadegh got along. They got along well. And Truman supported him in some ways. But this story, next slide please, had a very sad ending. And we know that the U.S. government, driven by the Cold War and domestic imperatives and anti-communist hysteria in the country, sided eventually with the British, went against with the British and against the Iranian nationalists. And here you see the pro-Shah gang leader, a man known as Shaban Jafari, or sometimes referred to as Shaban the Brainless, leading his men in the Anglo-American coup of 1953 that deposed Mossadegh. Okay, so that's the history. U.S., there's a long history here, and much of it is positive. Much of it is positive. But let's jump ahead. Let's jump ahead to 2000 to President Obama's first term. Let's jump ahead 50 years. What happened was, as I said, the president made this outreach, and it didn't work. It ran aground. Why? There are all kinds of reasons, but basically what happened was the president made his outreach, it didn't work, and when it didn't, both sides reverted to their familiar but dysfunctional patterns, what they had done before. They did what they knew how to do, whether it worked or not, but they knew how to do it, and they'd been doing it for 30 years, and they went back. So in both capitals, careers were built on bashing the other side. That's what people had done for 30 years. They bashed us, we bashed them. Did it do anything? Did it accomplish anything? Who cared? Who cared? Didn't matter. We knew how to do it, so that's what we did. So people did what they knew how to do. What they did not know how to do was change the relationship into something better. So they went back. Now, if I were giving this talk 4 years ago, if we were back in 2012, early 2013, here I would end. And I would end on basically this stalemate situation. But in the last 3 years, since 2013, there are signs that things are changing. Could it be fun? Here you see the first meeting between foreign ministers. This is September 2013, since 1979, since that October 1979 slide that I showed you. And this is Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif. Now that earlier meeting, as I said, was disastrous. But now the foreign minister are meeting, and they describe it as positive and productive. Now ask yourself, when was the last time anything between Iran and the United States was described as positive and productive? Those are not adjectives that we've heard for a very long time. So something is changing. Now, not only that, next slide please, but something else is happening. For the first time ever, the two presidents of the two countries are speaking to each other directly by telephone. I like to say, well, what you see here is Hassan speaking to Hussein. Now, these are major changes. Like them or not, you may think, well, this is terrible. We're being nice to not nice people. We're being nice to terrorists. We're being nice to this. But like it or not, these are major changes. Do they mean that we've escaped the hold of the iron rules? Are we finally out off that road? Are we out from under those rules? Are we off the road to nowhere? Probably not. Probably not. But there are possibilities, things that didn't exist. I mean, when you have this happening, there are new possibilities that didn't exist just a few years ago. Now, here's the question. These changes, are they going to bring better relations between the two countries? Are we going to be able to go back to a more friendly relationship? Well, let me put on my Iran expert hat and say, with great confidence, I don't know. But they did lead to allowing us, they opened the possibility that we were able to negotiate an agreement on Iran's nuclear program, eventually. We came to an agreement in 2015, and that, back in 2009, I would have said, that's impossible. We'll never get there. This is just too hard to do. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as usual, I was wrong. In this case, happy to be wrong, but wrong. Now, let me repeat that change does not mean, these changes do not mean that we and the Iranians are friends, or that the Islamic Republic is going to change its ways and improve its relations with Israel, or treat its own citizens decently. I mean, I wish it were so, but I don't see that happening soon or easily. Next slide, please. As you see from this cartoon from a Tulsa, Oklahoma paper of all things, change is hard. You see people, the crowd, the leader is trying to change the slogan. He's trying to get the crowd to chant "Common Cold to America" instead of "Death to America." And the crowd isn't buying it. The crowd isn't buying it. The crowd still chants death to America. Change is going to be tough. But let me leave you, before we go into questions, because I really want to hear from you, let me leave you with one thought. And I ask you to ask yourselves, what happens when for years two sides in a dispute are unable to talk? And if it's countries, if it's neighbors, if it's family members, whatever it is. In that case, what happens is that the other, the one that we are not talking to, becomes simultaneously superhuman and subhuman. The superhuman we fear because it is capable of superhuman feats. So Iran becomes capable of building and delivering an atomic bomb tomorrow. Or the United States, from the Iranian point of view, is capable of pushing a button and organizing an overthrow of the Islamic Republic, just with the push of a button. That's the superhuman. The subhuman, what about the subhuman? If we fear the superhuman, the subhuman we despise, as we might rats or cockroaches, because the subhuman is not restrained by any consideration of law, of decency, or morality. And once that happens, once we see the other side in that way, we can rationalize, we can justify the most extreme and the most ill-considered actions against such an adversary. Because if they are superhuman, they can destroy us. If they are subhuman, then we should do what? We should destroy them. And that, in there lies the danger of not talking, not interacting. Okay. From now, I'd like to hear from you, and like to hear. I'll address your questions as well as I can. When I speak to my students at the Naval Academy, as you see from the next slide, please, they are absolutely fascinated, on the edge of their chairs, and just brimming over with questions. So thank you for your attention, and I will. I don't know if you have microphones here for questions, or you just want to shout them out, and I'll repeat them. Yeah, let's start over here.
Go back to the previous slide, Emma. I am incredibly optimistic for change. If you notice, there's one person in the crowd. He's wearing a New York Yankees hat. If that's not change, I don't know what is. On a serious note, is how much does American culture have as an impact on the average Iranian citizen, and is that something that brings us a little closer together?
Okay, let me repeat the question. It's a good question. Let me repeat the question. The question is sort of on the noticing somebody in the crowd with a New York Yankees hat and talking about does culture bring us together? Is there a possibility? And my answer is it's complicated. Would that it did. Would that the exchanges of athletes and writers and filmmakers and painters, which people here. I mean, Nancy Matthews has been working the exchanges of artists and painters for a long time. Unfortunately, politically, it hasn't worked. It hasn't really done much. The hostility remains. The stalemate remains. Maybe part of the reason is that there is a lot of suspicion in Iran about the influence of our culture, or at least among the authorities. Ayatollah Khomeini, I think once, correct me if I have this wrong, but he once said, I don't worry about America's ships and planes and tanks. I worry about its popular culture and its ability to undermine the revolutionary fervor of our youth. Now this is complicated because think about this. Psychologically, what he's saying is this culture is very attractive. He doesn't say it's a bad culture. What's bad about it is it's so damn good, and it's so attractive. I don't know if you saw, there was a PBS program about a year ago about a partisan of the revolution who is known as Mr. Big Mouth. And Mr. Big Mouth always gets out there and shouts the anti-American slogans the loudest. And the reporter went and interviewed him, and he talked about him, and he said, the West is really a terrible place. My cousin is in Canada, and he married a Canadian woman, and I don't speak to him anymore because if he comes back here, she'll come back and she'll be wearing a tank top, and isn't that terrible? And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, sure, I bet you think that's terrible. So this is, it is very complicated, but there's no doubt that there's an attraction. I mean, Iran has never isolated itself. It's never been a hermit kingdom. 2,500 years ago, the historian Herodotus noticed this about the Persians. In his book, The History of the Persian War, he said, no people are so ready to adopt foreign ways as the Persians. Nobody does it like the Persians, and nobody takes this foreign ways and gives it its own particular flavor like the Persians. Now, people will argue with me about this, but look at what Iran did with Islam. Took a austere, simple religion coming out of the Arabian desert and turned it into a world civilization. It adopted it very strongly. I don't minimize that. They became great adherents of the religion. But if you go to an exhibit today of Islam, what's called Islamic art, calligraphy, painting, tile work, all of these things, 70–80% of what you will see will be Iranian. So I'm getting at the question, but you really have opened a whole subject area which is just fascinating. And then the political implications of that also are very strong. So thank you for an excellent question. In the very back.
And I have a microphone that I'll bring over there too. I just want to encourage people asking questions to keep them short and to save narrative from the beginning.
All right. I'll try to keep my answers short, but you can see what happens.
Well, we're here to listen to you, so that's why the questions should be on the shorter side.
Please.
Where were you when you found out you were coming home?
In 1981?
Yep.
Okay. When the agreement was reached, we were in Tehran. In some building up in North Tehran, and they came around. Some of those students came around and said, "We need you to go for a medical exam." And I said, I'm not playing your game anymore. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to cooperate. We don't need a medical exam. We need to leave. And he said, "Oh no, you're leaving. You're leaving." I said, "Oh, in that case, all right, all right." And then there's some out there. He said, "There's some Algerian doctors here who want to look at you." And he said, "Well, if it's Algerians, it's okay. It's okay." But that's where we were. And then that was the night of the 19th. And then we went there, and they pulled us aside and said, "We're going to do television interviews with you, and some of you are going home." That's what they said. Some of you are going home, and we're going to do television. Well, the message is pretty clear. What you say will keep you here, or go home. Well, then, but it didn't work very well, because then when I met I saw the Algerian doctors, I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, you're leaving." And I said, "All of us?" He said, "Yeah, all of you. All of you are leaving." That was like 3 in the morning or something between the 19th and the 20th Tehran time. Then you can imagine, we didn't get much sleep that night, and then the next day, nothing happened. All that day through the 20th. Now remember the time difference. We're talking about 9.5 hour time difference. Where Tehran is ahead. Tehran is 9.5 hours ahead. So all through the day of the 20th, nothing happens, and we're thinking, this thing's gone off the rails. Then about 7 o'clock, around sundown, maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock, you hear artillery going off, and it's saluting rounds. It's not real shooting, because we'd heard enough of that from the Iran-Iraq War, and they say, well, it sounds like they're saluting some great victory. And of course, what happened was, then they came in and said, let's go get on the bus, and we're going. Well, what happened was, of course, they were waiting to release us to the very last minute after of Jimmy Carter's administration, and they did not want to release us while Jimmy Carter was still president. And so the plane took off, I think, about half an hour after President Reagan had taken the oath of office, and you saw the selection in the film. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, over here, please. Right there, right inside.
I know that as of right now, there's still a lot of hostility and distrust between the Americans and Iran. But I was wondering if you have any ideas or any propositions on how we can change the situation, or anything that we can do as a whole to make this better.
Okay, good question. Very, very, very good question. Sort of, I mean, clearly the mistrust is there. And I'll just tell you one story to give you an example. Back a couple of years ago, the Iranians announced that they were ready to switch on the Bushehr nuclear reactor, this nuclear power plant that had been building in Bushehr back since the 70s. And around 2010, 2011, they said, we're ready to switch it on. Okay, a reporter comes and he asks Secretary Clinton, what do you think about this? You know, and the implication was, oh, those evil Iranians that are building a bomb, so forth and so on. No, she says, no, we don't worry about it. We know what it is. We know the design. We know the safeguards. It's not anything. It has no military implications. No, it's fine with us. So then they go back to this, or another reporter goes back to an Iranian official. I don't know who it was, but he goes to an Iranian official and he says, well, you know, what do you think about this? This is the American Secretary of State, you know, and the implication was, well, she's so hostile all the time. Why are the Americans saying these nice things about us? And the answer, you could probably guess what it was. The answer was, well, we don't know what they're up to, but we know they're up to something. We know there's a trick in there somewhere. You know, how do you overcome that? How do you overcome that? With great difficulty, with great patience, the kinds of programs that Nancy Matthews does, the exchanges, you know, the fact that people can come and go to the United States, can come and go to Iran, the kinds of the tours that some of you, the visits that some of you have been on. You know, this was really the sort of the drop at a time, but gradually to build down to break down that wall of mistrust. Let me give one more example. I'm sorry to give such long answers, but you raise such interesting points. Give you an example of what works. Are any of you familiar with something called the Mississippi Delta Health Project? Is that familiar to anyone? Okay. Mississippi Delta, as you know, is one of the poorest areas in our own country, and it has all the worst metrics in terms of education, health, social well-being, and so forth. And people have tried everything in the Mississippi Delta. And somehow the people there discovered a system of rural health delivery in Iran. It was called the Khaneh Behvars, rural health houses. Is what they did. And this was a way of delivering health services to underserved areas. And when they discovered this, it might have been in some conference, they said, this sounds interesting. And they approached Iran. They approached the Iranians through medical school to medical school, I believe, to say, you know, we're interested in this. And the Iranians came back and said, of course. Of course, and they got the program going, and they've had visits going back and forth and so on. Now, why does this work? Why does something like this work? It works because it reverses what is the normal order of things. In other words, the normal order of things would be the United States or Britain or France or Germany provides technical assistance to a backward place. Well, of course, what's the effect of that? It doesn't really gain you much trust or affection. But here, it's the opposite. It's the Iranians with a system helping something in the United States, a difficult place in the United States. And when the people from the project went to Iran, they told me this story. They said, we were out in the village rural area near Shiraz, and we stopped in a tea house, And we were talking English, and the people in the tea house said, well, who are these people? And they said they're Americans. And they said, oh, I thought we got rid of the Americans. And I said, no, they're here to learn from us. And the reaction was, that's different. That's different. And the way it was put was, I didn't know the rain fell up. I didn't know the rain fell up. In other words, that's the kinds of things that work. But it's going to be hard. That's going to be it's going to take persistence. There are going to be defeats. There are going to be setbacks along the way. And at the end of the day, how do you if someone is convinced that you are his enemy and you are attempting to do him wrong, how do you convince him otherwise? With great difficulty. Okay, over here, please. We got a microphone coming.
A question about the recent nuclear arms deal that was made. We released some sanctions. They stopped their march to nuclear weapon. I just read in the paper that now the U.S. Senate unanimously has reinstated sanctions from a 1996 treaty to reinstate other sanctions. Now, A, I want to know if that is true. B, what are those sanctions? And then C, doesn't that feed into written in stone, the other side always has a trick up its sleeve?
The answer is yes and yes. The sanctions that were renewed were not related to the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal brought relief to Iran from a very specific set of sanctions that were originally put in 2010 following a United Nations Security Council resolution. And these apparently, as far as we know, and we can't know this for sure, but as far as we know, these were pretty effective sanctions because they were international. It wasn't just the United States. It was, South Korea, Japan, China, all the major countries that trade with Iran were involved in these sanctions. The other things that made them effective was that Iran had great difficulty selling its crude oil. Well, if you can pump the oil, you can extract it, you can refine it, but if you can't sell it, it's really of no use to you. So it had difficulty selling its oil, and it had terrible difficulty accessing the world banking system. And the world banking system is, that's how you pay for what you buy. That's how you pay for what you buy. That's how it's paying for the $80 million worth of Boeing aircraft that they want to buy, that they recently have agreed to buy. But these sanctions are not related to the nuclear deal. They are earlier, and I think they are unilateral. As far as I know, they are unilateral sanctions. They are American sanctions, and they were put on for reasons of they deal with terrorism, they deal with human rights, they deal with some other issues. But what the administration has insisted on, and I think correctly, is that the nuclear deal was about one subject. It was about Iran's nuclear program. It was not about Iran's human rights record, which is terrible. It's not about prisoners, American prisoners in Iran, or Iranian American prisoners in Iranian jails, which is, again, a terrible situation. But if you're negotiating, negotiation is going to become a big subject, I think, under the new administration. But anyone who does negotiating, if you want to agree on everything, you will agree on nothing. You cannot you put all these other things on the table, you could never reach an agreement. Now, it will be Obviously, on the Iranian side, this will be seized on by people who do not like the deal anyway, and they will say, you see how, as you pointed out, you see how untrustworthy the Americans are. We sign a deal with them, and they turn around and extend sanctions. But the reality is something else. Okay, another question. Down in front here. Can we get a, wait for a mic, please.
First, thank you for coming, and then just from perspective, since I lived in Iran 75 through just before 78 leaving, and having a passion for that culture and being there, like you said. So my question for all you've been through and with all the history you provided and what we're discussing, could you say that from your perspective that you would say we're going in the last, like where Obama was communicating, to a positive and progressive point, or do you feel like you're still in, it's too complicated?
I love that. Always escape. Give me the, thank you for giving me the escape clause there, the way out. Look, I mean, we all know international relations history moves in strange directions. You know, sometimes you make progress, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you go sideways. You go sideways. But the agreement, and it's not just the agreement, but the whole way of doing business. You know, the slides I showed you of Secretary Kerry and Prime Minister Zarif, or the fact that, and I mentioned the capture of the sailors, the fact that when these sailors were captured, what could have become a new, you know, a mini version of the hostage crisis did not. Why did it not? Because Secretary Kerry was able to pick up the phone and talk to his friend Javad and say, Javad, we have a problem. We have a problem. And because they had been talking to each other professionally and courteously for 2.5 years before that. That's what diplomacy is about. Now, by contrast, in 1979, we are captured. We're not released soon, as everyone thought we would be. And so President Carter, the book solution is that the Secretary of State or the President calls his counterpart in the other country and says, "Look, you have to take care of this. You have to take care of this." In this case, there was nobody to talk to. Nobody was on the other end of the phone. The so-called government had resigned. There was nobody there. Anybody who would answer the phone couldn't do anything, and anybody who could do anything wouldn't answer the phone. So President Carter sends a written message, and in the diplomatic life, this is a big deal for a head of state to send a written message to someone, to Ayatollah Khomeini, saying essentially, you know, let our people out, and we can always talk about the relations, but you have to let the people out. He gives it to Ramsey Clark to take to Tehran. Ramsey Clark, as you remember, was, I think, Attorney General in the back in the Johnson administration, was sort of a big Democratic troubleshooter for the Democratic Party. And Ramsey Clark takes it, gets as far as Istanbul, and his plane lands in Istanbul because Khomeini says, if he comes, no one can meet him. No official can meet him, and basically says, don't come. And you might say it took 34 years for that message to get delivered. So it was there. So, yeah. Now, in the nuclear deal, getting back to the nuclear deal, which somebody mentioned, people can argue about it. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you like it for this? Do you like it for that? But what you can't deny is that it is the result of, it comes and it represents changes, radical changes in the way of doing business between our two countries. Now, will it last? Will it hold? Well, so far it has. So far it has. And, according to all the monitors, each side has carried out its commitments. I mean, 98% of them, or 97%, which is pretty damn good in any deal. There are always going to be minor questions in any agreement, but by all accounts, the Iranians have done what they said they were going to do, and we have said what we have done what we have said we're going to do, even to the point that our administration has encouraged, for example, they encouraged the Boeing deal. We have encouraged American banks to allow transactions in other currencies to clear through New York. This is a very technical thing, but apparently almost any banking transaction you do in any currency at one point touches the New York banking system. And so our administration has sort of told Treasury and the banks and said, look, let this happen because this is part of the this is part of the agreement. So far it is held. Now I realize, and I'm going to get a little partisan here, but I realize we have entered a period of, I don't know, what do you call it? Counterfactualism? Does that work? Or post-truthism, or whatever you call it. So, to look at a worst case, you could say, the Iranians, since the Iranians have violated the deal, we're going to cancel it. Or since the Americans have violated the deal, we're going to cancel it. Well, what have they violated? Well, they violated it. They violated it. I mean, the kinds of rhetoric that we have been hearing recently is that sort of situation. But at least if we deal with the facts of the matter, the deal has held. And it's held clearly because, like any deal that you negotiate, if it lasts, it's in the interests of both sides. I mean, you all know, if you walk away, if you make an agreement and you walk away thinking you've been cheated or knowing you've been cheated, that deal isn't going to last. It's not going to last very long. So the only way the deal is going to last if both sides see it in their interest, and that seems to be the case so far. In the far back there, let's go to the far back.
Thanks. What do you think the future of the Iranian theocracy is? Because it seems, I was in Iran for 2 years, 69 to 71, and Iran was moving very strongly toward the West. And what I hear, at University of Tehran and other things that are happening is there's still a lot of people that want to go that way. And it seems, the theocracy seems very out of step with that. So I'd just be really interested in your.
It's a good question. It's a good question. Well, I mean, look, we back in that period, our analysts got it wrong because they underestimated the force of and the power of religion in the society. And yeah, there were a lot of things that looked very modern and very, very Western, but at the base of society, Shia Islam was still a very strong force, and it was underestimated. Now, about what you have now though is a group of you called theocracy. That's good because it is a rule by a particular group of senior group of Shia clerics, and these are the same people who've been in power since 1979. I mean, you saw the picture of me and Mr. Khamenei. You know, that was 1980. He was a big deal then, he's a big deal now. And the same group. Now they've traded off, and you know, eventually even these guys die, though. I have a good friend who's a very good analyst on Iran, Karim Sajjadpour, and he talks about this ruling clique of senior clerics, and he says, well, you know, their average age is deceased. But they're not going to go quietly, I can tell you that. Nobody, I mean, one fact I've noticed about the Iranian political system, nobody ever leaves voluntarily. You know, you either die, you either pushed out or you die, but otherwise you stay on indefinitely. And there are jokes about one of the senior clerics, a man named Janati, whom they say, if you look in his phone book, his little pocket phone book, you'll see telephone numbers for Cain and Abel. You know, so these guys aren't going to go easily. But the point you made is a good one, because what seems to be happening is you have a growing split between a population, a society that is savvy, that is well educated, that is connected to the rest of the world, that is curious about the rest of the world, that is open to the rest of the world. That's the society. You have a state that is rigid, that is brutal, that doesn't want to change, that won't give up power, and the gap is clearly growing. And the question is, how long can that go on before the whole system collapses? Some Iranians that I've spoken to say, look, we do not want another revolution. We've had enough violence. We had the war, this horrible war. We had this very difficult revolution. We don't want it. But they can see the system sort of collapsing under its own weight. Can we have one more question? Do we have?
We have time for one more question.
What do you believe are Iran's foreign policy goals in the Middle East?
Okay. Now, here, I'm glad you asked that question. My gosh, did I plant that question with you? Because here's where I disagree with a lot of senior authorities about Iran. Who paint Iran as this expanding, their favorite word is hegemonic. That's the word they love. This expanding hegemonic power. I mean, if you go back to 2012, the presidential election, and Mr. Romney's statement about Iran. Do you remember this? He says, we got to worry about Iran because Iran has this relationship with Syria, and the reason it has the relationship with Syria is to secure access to the sea. What? He said it. I'm not making this stuff up. Now, the last time I looked, Iran had about 1,200 miles of access to the Persian Gulf. And the only thing I can ask myself is, here's this guy, he went to Harvard Business School. I mean, Harvard, that's Harvard. I went to Harvard too. Don't they teach geography at Harvard Business School? Well, it is a business school, but anyway. And then you have people like, you have people talking like Henry Kissinger talking about the new Persian Empire. This expands. Oh, the Persians were about to come storm the Acropolis and burn it down, like they did in the 5th century BC. I mean, there has not been a Persian Empire for 1,500 years. It's gone. It's gone. And Iran, but I will give them this. The politicians can talk big. You know, the Iranian politicians can talk big. They can talk about reclaiming territory that has been lost for hundreds of years. You know, they will recover Samarkand and Bukhara and Baku and all these places that were historic, you know, at one point, and Afghanistan and Bahrain and all of these other places. Not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And the reason is very simple. We are, you know, despite all of the brave talk that you hear coming out of Tehran, Iran politically and geostrategically is in a very bad place. Why? Well, part of it is history and ethnography. You know, Iran is different from its neighbors. It speaks a different language. It follows a different religion. I call the Iranians the Bretons of the Middle East. You know the story, the Bretons in the year 1100, the Bretons showed up to go on the crusade, go on the first crusades, and other people asked them, well, who are you? And they say, well, we're Christians like you, and we want to go off and save the Holy Land. And they say, yeah, but you speak a language no one understands, and you worship saints that nobody's ever heard of. And that's the case with the Iranians. They're isolated. They're not Turks, they're not Arabs, they're not Sunnis like just about everybody else. Who are their friends? And add to that, add to kind of natural isolation, really bad politics, bad foreign policy. I mean, you know, the Iranians don't, and my Iranian friends will excuse me, but this government, you're surprised they have any toes left. They've shot themselves in the foot so often. I mean, look around. Who are their friends? Who are their friends in the Middle East? You know, who likes them? Certainly not most of their Arab neighbors. They get along with Syria, but what kind of condition is Syria in? I mean, Syria is a disaster, is a disaster. Their only other friend, do you know who their only other friend is? This is really unusual. This is pardon? Russia is not a friend. Russia, but who's their other friend in the region? Do you know? Armenia. Armenia, Christian, landlocked, 4 million people, Armenia. Because they both hate the Azeris so much. You know, that's not a good place to be in. So, yeah, and I suspect you will hear in the coming months and perhaps coming years, a lot of things about a, you know, hegemonic Iran, Iran on the march, Iran, the new Persian Empire, all of these things. When you hear them, I only ask you, be very suspicious. Be very suspicious about what this is, because the reality is really something very different. Okay, well, thank you all so much. You've been a great audience, and thank you again for the invitation.
Ambassador, please stay. Thank you for coming. We do have a gift for Ambassador Limbert, and this is a beautiful book on the crown of the continent, so representing Montana. So let's thank Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Very grateful for you to be here. And please take your knowledge and share it with the world. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.